All right, good morning, everyone. First of all, thanks to the Center for New Media and all that were involved in putting this event together. I really appreciate being here. Generally, I give some little spiel about the Brennan Center, but given the short time and all that I want to talk about, I'll just say, particularly for any students that are here, the Brennan Center is a think tank and public interest law firm based at NYU Law School, and we're always looking for summer interns, whether they're law students, undergrads, grad students. So I encourage you, if you're at all interested, to take a look at the Brennan Center's website and contact me if you're interested in spending a summer in New York. And we also have externship programs during the school year. So I'm going to use my 15 minutes here to talk about something that's on the mind of a lot of people 2 weeks before Election Day, is how we secure our election infrastructure. And what I mean by election infrastructure is the equipment and the tools that we use to administer and vote in elections in the United States. So there are many, many challenges to securing our election infrastructure. I'm going to focus on three of them that I think are some of the biggest challenges. One is just the complexity of a system of elections in the United States. The second is division of responsibility to protect our elections. As I'll talk about in a little while, there are several government agencies and other entities that bear responsibility for that. And finally, the added complexity of having so many different private actors really responsible for that infrastructure. It is probably not nearly as much of a government responsibility as people might think. So I'm going to start with a map of Texas. This map is from Verified Voting. And this lists the different kinds of primary polling place voting machines in the state of Texas. And you'll notice that there are different colors by counties. The orange color are what are known as direct recording electronic voting machines. They can be touch screens, often push button machines, but basically you are voting directly onto the machine is recording your vote. Some of those machines have paper trails, some of them in Texas do not. In addition, in many counties in Texas, they're just voting directly on a paper ballot, which I believe is what you probably do here in Berkeley. You're filling out that paper ballot and it's scanned by a computer. As you can see, again, this is determined at the county level. So even within Texas, there are many different kinds of machines. But this actually misses some of the complexity within Texas because, first of all, these are just in broad strokes, the types of machines. But each county may use a different vendor in purchasing those machines. And among the vendors, whether it's a company called ES&S, Dominion, there are different models. And then on top of that, of course, lots of people in Texas vote by mail. In 2016, about 500,000 people voted by mail. They use different equipment for vote by mail. Again, may differ by county. And on top of that, people vote early in Texas. In 2016, about 5 million people voted early, and what you vote on in a particular county in Texas early may be different than what you vote on Election Day. So lots of variety in Texas that isn't even represented in this map that Verified Voting put together. Of course, when we multiply that, this is actually a map of nothing. It's just all the counties in the United States. But you get the picture. When you multiply that by all 50 states, there's really a huge variety in how we run elections. And often when we talk about running elections in the United States, you hear about it's the states versus the federal government, who's in charge. In fact, there are about 10,000 election jurisdictions in the United States. And when we're talking about running elections, it's really at that local level where many decisions are being made. And this is a theme that I'm going to come back to. if you're in a San Francisco or a Los Angeles, you may have a lot of resources. The vast, vast majority of jurisdictions that are administering elections in the United States really have almost no resources. If you think about something like having an IT staff and somebody that can help with cybersecurity, often there's really nobody and no budget. So to add a final level of complexity, I was just talking about voting machines here, but in fact, when we're talking about election infrastructure, the media very often, when talking about hacking elections, it's all about voting machines. But in fact, the infrastructure is pretty big and goes way beyond just voting machines themselves. And if we look back at the 2016 election and what the Russians targeted, as far as we know, it wasn't the voting machines. It was sending phishing attack emails to election officials, perhaps to go after election websites. It was targeting voter registration databases where the voter rolls, names, that's how you determine whether or not people can vote and where they can vote. It was targeting a private vendor that manufactures electronic poll books. These are tablets that are used to check in voters on election day. And if you mess with any of those, you can create real problems. If we go beyond just what happened in the United States in 2016, we'll see other things that have been targeted, including what comes after the voting machines, right? We vote on voting machines, but those votes are tallied at some point in a central location, and then the totals are reported on election night. And I want to talk about one attack that happened in 2014. Does anybody know who Dmytro Yarosh is? One person. So there's no reason that, sorry? Oh, you're from Ukraine. Okay. So no reason for most people to know who Dmytro Yarosh is. But he received less than 1% of the vote in the 2014 election. But shortly before the results were announced in Ukraine, the authorities discovered a virus on their tallying system that would have produced the results on election night and would have wrongly declared Dmytro the winning party with 37% of the vote. The screenshot on the left, coincidentally, I'm sure, the same day the virus was discovered, Russia Channel 1 incorrectly reported that his party had won the election with the exact same 37% that was on the virus that was discovered. So just by looking at just by looking at these two elections, sorry, I'll move just one sec here. I think it should be pretty obvious that this is a threat that's real, and that pretty much everybody, I hope at this point in the United States, agrees that cyber attacks against some part of our election infrastructure is a legitimate thing to be concerned about. So the next question comes, who's going to protect us from those? So this is a not very good diagram of all of the government entities, actually not all of them, but many of the government entities that are charged in some way with dealing with this problem. Congress in March, after not funding federal elections in any way for over a decade, provided the states with $380 million for election system security, said it was a one-time thing. They're not going to do that again anytime soon, they say. And there were no restrictions really put on the use of that money. We have various federal agencies that are supposed to help deal with this problem. The Department of Homeland Security, after the 2016 election, Jay Johnson made election infrastructure critical infrastructure, which means that there are various services that they can offer free of charge to the states to help them secure their elections. The Election Assistance Commission and the National Institute for Standards and Technology provide some voluntary guidance on voting machines security and federal certification for voting machines, although it's up to the states whether or not they want to use that system. And then that middle row there are various coordinating councils that have been established since the 2016 election to share information. Finally, at the bottom, you have states and counties, and again, as I said, cities and towns that are actually administering the elections. So again, I want to point out, and there's often really a struggle, and this is something that we deal with at the Brennan Center, between the states and the counties over how elections should be administered. We're all often lobbying the states at the Brennan Center to do things, and I'm going to come back to this in a little while, like to make sure that there's sufficient number of provisional ballots. I'll talk about what those are in case there are problems on election day, and the states will say, well, we can advise our counties, but they may not listen to us. And in many states, there really is a very little control that the states, the Secretary of State, for instance, has over the counties and what they can do. So one solution to all of this might be, and again, I go back to this 10,000 election jurisdictions, would be for Congress to actually provide sufficient funds to these very dispersed locales and say, here's what you have to do with that money. There's some minimum standards of security. You have to hire up. You have to have paper backups for your voting machines. There are a number of things that I would love to see them do. So certainly that's something that they have the authority to do. And this is the Elections Clause under the Constitution. When it comes to federal elections, and the courts have interpreted this fairly broadly, Congress has a lot of leeway, particularly if they're providing money, with saying what the states and localities have to do in terms of running their elections. Aside from the fact that right now in Congress there isn't a lot of will to provide more money or minimum standards for running elections, there's also a lot of resistance from a very powerful group, and that is the Secretaries of State around the country. And just last week, the Secretaries of State put out a statement saying they want money, but don't tell us what to do with that money. There should be no new restrictions on how we spend that money. And the result is that we have vastly different practices across the country from state to state in dealing with election system security, with some election officials saying they just don't believe that this is really a threat. So I'm going to go back again to this map of the players in the election space. Does anybody notice a big set of players who are missing here? Private vendors, right? I talked about them earlier. So these are all kind of generally related in one way or another, a creature of government. But the private vendors are not listed here, and private vendors play a huge part of almost every link in this infrastructure map. So they build election websites, they build and maintain registration databases, they build those electronic poll books with really almost no standards. There are no federal standards, and in many states no standards for what those have to look like and what kind of security there needs to be in them. Of course, they build the voting machines, they program the voting machines, they maintain the voting machines, they maintain the vote tallying software and upgrade often in states, even for election night reporting. Voting machine vendors, unlike, say, defense contractors or other industries that are part of critical infrastructure, are not required under federal law to do background checks on their employees. They're not required, believe it or not, to report any hacks of their businesses or systems. They are not required to notify their customers if they are sold, who owns them. They are not even required to be owned by Americans. And the state of Maryland found this out this summer when they learned, to their surprise, that the company that had purchased the vendor for their registration database was closely linked to a Russian oligarch who has very close ties to Vladimir Putin. So, in fact, one stat that I'd like to talk about is ballpoint pens have more federal regulations than the voting system infrastructure. There really are no federal regulations of that infrastructure. In 2006, I chaired a task force of security experts and computer scientists on voting machine security. And at the time, a lot of these folks were saying to me, don't you realize how much the Chinese and the Russians would love to control the outcome of an election? They have so many resources at their disposal. Don't you think they could get somebody hired at one of these voting machine vendors or pay somebody off? And I have to admit at the time, it sounded really ridiculously paranoid to me. I'm no longer so sure about that. And I want to give one example of why there should be concern about that. As you can see, this guy's name is Roger Duronio. I don't know if anybody knows who he is. He was an employee of the UBS Bank. In 2002, Roger got very upset because his end-of-the-year bonus was only $32,000. He thought he was entitled to much more than that, and so he quit. But before he quit, he planted a logic bomb to delete all the files in the bank's central data server, and then every server in every branch. And several weeks after he planted that bomb, 2,000 servers in over 400 branch offices went down. So you can imagine, obviously, somebody working at a voting machine vendor, which often does programming for, in the case of the biggest vendor in the US, probably thousands of counties' voting systems, how much damage could be done. And so this is particularly relevant to the discussion of voting machine security. You'll often hear election officials say, unlike the things that were targeted in 2016, registration databases, voting system vendors with phishing attacks, voting machines aren't connected to the internet, so we don't have to worry about hacking them. There's a lot that's wrong with that argument, which I won't get into, but even if we accepted that as true, you don't necessarily need to be in a basement in Moscow to create lots of problems for the voting machines themselves. So this may sound all really depressing, and I don't want to leave people feeling hopeless. I think there are there are a lot of easy things that we can do, even if we're not doing a particularly good job, or as good a job as I would like, I should say, of protecting our election infrastructure. And the main thing is we have a fairly resilient system if we make sure that it's robust enough. So the Help America Vote Act requires provisional ballots. I mentioned those earlier. Under the Help America Vote Act, if somebody shows up at the polling place and they're not listed on the registration rolls, or the e-poll books that so many states have now aren't working, they are entitled to a provisional ballot where they fill out their information, and we can go back later and figure out what happened, and if we find out that there was some kind of hack of the system, we can count their votes. The challenge is making sure that there are enough provisional ballots in every polling place. There's a requirement for them. There's no requirement for a number. I would say at the Brennan Center, we're urging counties to have about 2 to 3 hours worth of provisional ballots in every polling place. That's an easy one, but the challenge is getting all 10,000 local jurisdictions to do that. Same thing with having paper backups for machines, for electronic poll books, and doing audits afterwards using that paper. The good news is in 2018, probably about 80% of Americans will vote on systems that have paper backups that we can look at to check the software afterwards. And I am very hopeful that by 2020, that number will be closer to 95%. The challenge is actually getting anybody to look at the paper afterwards, and so that's a fight, but I think that there's a lot of potential for progress there. Longer term, the kind of big challenges that I mentioned, I think are going to be tougher because we do have a Congress right now that isn't interested in doing more in this space, or at least leadership isn't interested in doing more in this space. There's been some bipartisan movement, but not enough to get past leadership. We definitely need more money. We really don't invest in our elections. We need to start I believe, legislating the kind of information sharing that's happening so it's required before every election, having some kind of minimum guidelines, and actually having some real regulations on the vendors. And I think all of those are really big things to try to get Congress to move. And I'm not optimistic in the short term. I fear that we may have to have a crisis much bigger than what we saw in the 2016 election for that to happen. So I'll leave it on that sad note.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. That was terrifying, Larry. But even if you get through all of this and you don't get hacked, there are still ways that the system can mean your vote doesn't really count anyway. So here we plunge deeper into the depths. I'm going to talk to you today about partisan gerrymandering. So to start, actually, Nick, the talk this morning was fantastic. I actually didn't know the origins of the Census Bureau and how they worked out the counting. Now I want to read a whole history of it. But just for you all to understand why on earth redistricting is a thing, we have single member districts in the United States. So as long as we have them, we're going to have to draw those districts. And since the 1960s, the Supreme Court has said that we should have a one person, one vote rule, which essentially means the district should be the same size by population, although there are some quibbles as to what population means. This just shows you the projected number of change in the congressional districts after the next census. So as the population changes, they do reapportionment, which means my state of Illinois loses seats and your state here in California gains seats. And after reapportionment, then you have to say, okay, well, given how many congressional districts we have, where are we going to draw the lines? It's not just Congress, it happens for state houses and senates, and also things like city councils, school boards, library boards. In Chicago, we have water reclamation districts. There are lots of districts going on around the country. The next census, they always happen in the 0 year. It's sort of ridiculous that the census day is April 1, like April Fool's Day. But so that will happen in 2020. The results come out in 2021, and everybody madly draws their lines for the 2022 election. But that is not the end of it. I am still litigating over lines that were drawn in 2011. So let's go over the litigation side of things, and then I'll talk to you a little at the end about how you can have a better system. So just to give a history, gerrymandering got its name from Elbridge Gerry, a former vice president of the United States, but in 1812 he was the governor of Massachusetts. He helped to draw this district that the local newspaper thought looked like a salamander. And even though his name was Elbridge Gerry, they called it a gerrymander, so now we have gerrymandering. And he drew this district to advantage one of his supporters. He wanted to make sure he had this senator in office. I will caution you, though, that it is very easy to fall into the loop of, this district looks strange, it must be bad. These days, I think that you can look at the effects of districts and understand whether they are good or bad, not just the shapes. And so I like to show my wedding cake, because I married a redistricting lawyer. And actually the person who married us, our joint mentor, is Nate Persley. He's speaking on the next panel, so yay for Nate. Anyway, just a little TMI. The reason that we put this on our cake is partly because people, we have this CNN documentary coming out, there's these various people who are interested in this, and they always say, let's walk through a community and talk about how one side of the street is in one district and the other side is in another district. And as long as you're drawing lines, there will always be those streets, right? Somewhere has to be the edge. And so to me, it's not so interesting where the edges are, it's interesting which communities are included. And so this is the Illinois 4th Congressional District. It combines on the northwest, it was drawn in the 90s by a court. On the northwest side of Chicago, which is a super segregated city, we have a Puerto Rican community. And on the southwest side of the city is a Mexican-American community. And so this district was drawn to connect those two groups together so we could elect our first Latino candidate of choice to Congress. Now, why didn't it just have like a barbell down the middle? Well, the west side of Chicago and the south side are predominantly African-American, and there was a congressperson elected from those communities. And so this is a way you can have a weirdly shaped district that still does some really good things. So when I talk about partisan gerrymandering, I don't just mean weird lines. I mean lines drawn with a very specific intention and effect of gaining advantage. Okay, just to give a little historical perspective, it's not just Republicans that gerrymander. Back in the 1970s, it was mostly Democrats doing the gerrymandering, similarly through the 1980s. I mean, there's a reason that Ronald Reagan is one of the biggest haters of gerrymandering. More people voted for Republicans at various points in the 80s, and yet the Democrats held the US House till 1994. So that was all well and good back then. The Democrats were like, rah, rah, we love gerrymandering. Fast forward, 40 years, and now it is the Republicans who gerrymander like crazy. We have this nice little couple of years where maybe it's not a full Rawlsian veil of ignorance, but maybe you don't know who's going to be in power in 2020, right? It could be a red wave or a blue wave or whatever. So we can start to get some changes in the state where people are like, well, I don't want the other side to gerrymander, so why don't we try to have a fair system? That said, politicians are incredibly short-sighted and always think they're going to win. And so there are many places where they refuse to give up the reins of power. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the litigation that we've done. The reason that we have been litigating is because in places like North Carolina and another state I've litigated in Wisconsin, they don't have a ballot initiative like you all have in here in California. And so unless they can convince the legislators who drew the gerrymander to give up their power, there's nothing they can do. And so far that has been a losing strategy. So they came to us back in 2013. Bill Whitford came and said, hey, I think my state's gerrymandered, and came to my husband and I, actually. We were just dating at that point. It's really worked out well. So we started the case out of Wisconsin. We then took that up to the Supreme Court, which was argued a year ago. We didn't lose. However, we also didn't win. We got a decision in June, essentially sending the case back to do more investigation on this question of standing, right? And I'll show you what we did in the North Carolina case and why you can see that they're interested in district-specific issues, not just statewide. So the reason we even got involved in North Carolina, we thought, look, this is a relatively conservative court. Now one might say an extremely conservative court. We knew that we couldn't just be like, hey, poor little Democrats. So we didn't want to bring 5 cases all representing Democrats. But while we were doing the case out of Wisconsin, the legislature in North Carolina had their congressional plan, struck down as a racial gerrymander. And so they had to redraw their lines. And they stood up and they said, you may have seen this on John Oliver's program or various other places, they said, okay, yeah, we are not going to consider race. We're not drawing a racial gerrymander. We are doing a partisan gerrymander. And they said, at the moment, the state is roughly 50-50. There are 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And they wrote this. This is not like we discovered this during some crazy discovery process on a machine that got hacked, which is the case in Wisconsin. In here, this was publicly released. We will draw these lines to advantage the Republicans. And this was essentially flouting 30 years of Supreme Court law that had said partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, right? Under the Constitution, you should treat parties equally. You should treat Republicans and Democrats alike. Now, the Supreme Court has said, we definitely think it's unconstitutional. We just don't know how to measure when it exists. And so 50 cases have been litigated since the 80s, and nobody's ever won until our case in Wisconsin, which I guess got reversed. So the Supreme Court is still looking for some way to test this. And we thought, well, hey, let's get the nerds involved. So we got a whole bunch of political scientists. Actually, the person who invented this metric, the efficiency gap, is a Berkeley, I think, undergrad and PhD, Eric McGee. He's great. He actually gave my dog a little Berkeley hoodie. So anyway. So he invented this thing called originally the wasted votes differential. We shortened that to the efficiency gap. And he said, look, it is not just that you can look at how many seats you get and how many votes you get and compare them in some way. And he said that the way that you gerrymander is through packing and cracking. So imagine, if you will, my state of Illinois. All of the Democrats live in Chicago, and the rest of the state is like 55 to 60% Republican. A really efficient way to gain advantage for Republicans is pack all of the Democrats into one area, so as few districts as possible, and then draw out the rest of the state to have Republican advantage. They did the same thing in North Carolina, Wisconsin, et cetera. You call that packing in the city, and then cracking, where you move apart the groups in the rest of the state. And then you add up what are called wasted votes. It's not a normative term. Everybody should vote. Your vote should count. But you can see in this tabulation on the right-hand side that the paler colored votes are the ones that you needed to win a district. The Democrats are only winning 3 districts in North Carolina. There's not very many votes that are actually contributing to a victory. And all the rest of them are either over the 50% that you need to win, or they're completely losing. And you should have the case, as I say, look, you see Democrats and Republicans pretty close. Sure, Republicans should maybe get more seats, but you shouldn't have one side wasting huge amounts of votes and the other side wasting so few votes. So this we thought was a really great metric that you can use, not just to say is something going on in one state, but can we compare all of the states to each other? Now, the expert that we had produced diagrams that were not as brilliant as this, and so then Mike Magursky, I'm going to call you out, our Code for America wonderful nerd, said, hey, I reckon we could make this look a little nicer. And so he developed this website called PlanScore. You can go online, you can check out all of the states that we have data for, state houses, eventually we'll have senates, we have congressional delegations going back to 1972. We thought this was important for the court to be able to say, let's set a limit on gerrymandering. Well, they didn't want to say everything gets struck down. And so we said, well, look, we can put this, this looks very much like a normal curve. Everything in the middle is okay. If you're close to a zero efficiency gap, and historically most of the states end up close, that's fine. But if you're on those outer limits, then you are having an extreme effect, and we think that's a problem. And because it's under the Constitution, we had the first part, which is intent. So you have to have intent and effect. If you intend to gain advantage, but you don't gain advantage, then you are Georgia of the 1990s, where they called it a dummy-mander, like, we're going to get advantage, and then they lost. And then there's the reverse. Robert Bork, noted conservative, was asked to draw districts for Connecticut. He drew it without looking at any of the data, and he drew a huge Democratic gerrymander, and nobody could accuse him of being a Democrat. So we think you need both, intent and effect. And then the third part of our test, this is another metric, partisan bias. There's actually now like a whole stack of metrics that the political science world has thrown up. They all tend to point in the same direction. So then we thought, well, the last part of this is you should say that there's no justification for what you've done. So a good example of this is in the one person, one vote cases, you need to have the same number of people, 700,000 in this district and 700,000 in that one. In Hawaii, though, they have a huge military base, and they wanted to use only the eligible voters as the basis for their population, because the military base all vote back in their home, and otherwise the military voters would get to choose who represents the people that live and stay in Hawaii even when the military leaves. And so the court said, yeah, that's the justification, right? That's okay to use a different apportionment base. And so we thought, well, we should give the states a way out. If you are genuinely trying to advance some goal, if you want to have entirely competitive districts, then it could be the case that everything shifts. If every district is 52-48 and you move 3%, the other side gets every seat, right? You may have that as a goal. Or you may be trying to promote minority representation, and so you may end up with packed Democratic districts. So we're trying to give the states a way to advance other goals. Now, in North Carolina, it turns out, we had our expert, Joey Chen from the University of Michigan, run a computer simulation where he said, I'm going to use all your criteria and just let my computer go and run 3,000 plans. And this chart shows all of the plans. And essentially, a zero efficiency gap is in the middle, so that's good. You can see some of his plans swing in the Democratic direction, some swing in the Republican direction. The y-axis goes, as you get higher, you're getting a more compact plan, and people like these compact districts, looks like a circle. So we would say, in the middle and at the top is what you're aiming for. And it turns out there are lots of plans that are there. But then you go all the way down to the corner, and that's the plan they enacted, right? There were 3,000 options, and they didn't get even close to that. And so we say, well, there isn't a justification. There are literally thousands of ways they could have done better, and they didn't do it. And so, there's different ways. In our Wisconsin case, we've gone back and focused on one particular plan to say this is an alternative that would have been better. And that's a new space that political scientists are really developing in, trying to work out simulations and what you can make and how you could code in legal things. So we go up to the Supreme Court a year ago with our Wisconsin case. This is just to show you some of our wonderful plaintiffs outside the Supreme Court. I was like, rah, rah, I litigate here. Also, one thing that was kind of hilarious is Arnold Schwarzenegger, your former governor, has been a big champion of the end gerrymandering movement, because the Democrats used to gerrymander here in California, and so he was instrumental in getting the propositions passed in 2008 and 2010 that meant you had an independent commission. And so he turned up to the Supreme Court and he sent a little note to my boss who argued the case with his little happy face. And then even better, Bill Whitford, who is quintessential professor from Madison, Wisconsin. So he's on the right-hand side here. He's got his little beard and his little glasses. And somehow the seating ended up that he was sitting next to Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Supreme Court. And I said, wow, what did you talk about? He's like, not much. Anyway, so we thought, hey, look at this Republican we have here. Come on, Supreme Court, let's strike down gerrymandering. They did not do that. They remanded the case to the district court so that the plaintiffs may have an opportunity to prove concrete and particularized injuries using evidence that would tend to demonstrate a burden on their individual votes. So as you can see, what we had presented so far was, let's look at the whole state and the whole effect on all people who are Democrats. And they say, no, let's pull out Bill Whitford himself. Tell me about his life. Tell me about where he lives and what he does. So in Wisconsin, we've gone back and got 40 plaintiffs. There are 99 districts, and we figure, look, if we change 40 of them, that's enough. In North Carolina, we already had a lot of stuff in the record, and so we've managed to get back up to the Supreme Court. We're actually briefing at the moment. And so that was where we pulled out one. So out of the 3,000 plans Joey drew, we pulled out this one, Plan 297. We literally said, which is the most compact? Okay, there it is. And so you can see we could pull out people. If you look at, say, District 6, you can say you used to be in a red district, but look in this other one, you could be in a blue district, and we think you're cracked. And then down in Charlotte, so in District 12, you can see it's very deep blue. That's because they packed everybody into that district. If you move across, you see actually in District 3, you're less packed, and so those Democrats can spread out a little further to help influence neighboring districts. And so essentially you can go from a 10-3 plan to a 7-6 plan. And so we are hoping that that will show the individual harm. The reason that gerrymanders hold these days is partly because of computers, right? We can pinpoint with surgical precision who you are and how you are likely to vote. But the reason we can tell how you're likely to vote is because of partisan polarization. It is not like people just turn up on election day and think, which candidate do I like? People identify very strongly as Republicans or Democrats. There are some people in the middle there are some people that say they're independent, but I can look at their voter file and tell you how they're going to vote. There are some people that swing a little bit, but as long as you have a very clear sense of who your party is, when you're drawing lines, not only do you draw them based on previous election results, but you can work out who's moving into my district, who's turning 18, who's becoming a citizen, who's passing away, how is this district going to change, and how can I maintain control for the next 10 years. So with all of this in hand, we say, well, let's actually use this amazing computing power and data for good. Let's use it to say, hey, we can do better. And let's hope that the Supreme Court will enforce this. But we have a backup plan, particularly after Kennedy retired. We have a real backup plan, which are independent redistricting commissions. So you guys have this in California. In 2011, around 30,000 people around the state applied to be part of the 14-member commission. It was chosen in kind of a jury-like way to have a certain amount of Republicans and independents and no affiliated people in the middle. They went around the state, had public hearings where people turned up and said, I think my community is this, it includes this or that, you know, that supermarket is a place we all go to, that highway we use, etc. And then they had actually, on a big screen like this, districts, and people could turn up and say, can you move the line a bit this way? A good example is in Los Angeles, the Korean community is never going to be big enough. Well, maybe it will be, but in 2010, it was not going to be big enough to be a majority of a single congressional district. But what they really wanted was to have one congressional rep to go to. So they said, can you not split us up into 4 districts like last time? And so on the screen, they could bring up the draft and say, oh, we did split you up. Okay, let's move that boundary. And now Koreatown is kept together. That is a democratic system where everybody decides and talks about their community, and then we get results. It's not that there's only one good plan. There are probably thousands of good plans. But I think modeling that behavior of, hey, let's keep the people involved is a good thing for the people that eventually get elected. So this cycle, I've helped out in trying to draft the language in 4, well, I did more than 4, but only 4 made it to the ballot. So there's an effort in Colorado called Fair Districts Colorado, Better Boundaries in Utah, Yes on One in Missouri, and then the Voters Not Politicians effort in Michigan. And to me, the Michigan one is the most inspiring because there, they didn't pay a single person to gather signatures. It was a purely volunteer-led effort. They were everywhere. One of my co-counselors from a very small town in Michigan, and she said, there was a card table at the end of my street. Like, if they're there, they are everywhere. So I really hope that these all win and we can start to just take power away from legislators, because litigating takes a really long time, and in the end, you're just affecting the outcome. But if you can actually affect the process, that's even better.
Okay, good morning. That's me. Thank you all so much for coming, especially this early. Thanks, Mike, for kind of roping me into this. I wasn't totally sure why I got invited to be on this panel, partly because when I work in, one, I am not a lawyer, so I apologize in advance, and two, you know, my work as it relates to infrastructure and its politics tends to look kind of more stuff like this. I do work around physical infrastructures of communications, like cables, data centers, that sort of stuff. This is my book. It's got pictures like this, and the reason that I found that very useful is because in trying to get people who maybe aren't particularly interested in or like very like well versed in some of the kind of more like more software sides of like what it is to live with networks as a major part of public life, if you can start with something that's like literally a little bit more like physically grounding, it can kind of help demystify it a little bit, right? Like it's like, this isn't like, you know, magic that's happening on like a cursed stone, even though it technically kind of is. It's like also happening like in a building somewhere, and it's happening with like objects, and workers have to put them in places. And one of the things that I've noticed over the last 5-ish years that I've kind of been in this space is watching companies like platforms get a lot more comfortable with their infrastructuralness. Like 10 years ago, like it was hard to get Google to admit they even had data centers, and now they like commission artists to paint murals on the sides of them. And that was kind of, this is a little bit more of a meta angle, so I feel like those were like such informative presentations. I'm like really like kind of impressed and like humbled to be part of this conversation. But I'm gonna kind of step back and talk a little bit more about the kind of political hack that I think is maybe most relevant to talking about like political infrastructures, which is sort of the way in which platforms and communication technologies invoke infrastructure as sort of like a rhetorical and political hack. And I appreciated also the definitions we went through, because I think in this case what I was thinking of is more like, you know when like you write some code and you like comment in it, like fix later, this is not the right way to do this. And then you don't, and then you go back and you like have to refactor everything. Like I feel like that is kind of the hack that is emergent here. And this isn't new, right? Like communications technologies are infrastructural to the kind of governance of public life. This is, and like they have known and embraced it. This is a like tile mosaic in the lobby of the former AT&T Longlines building in New York City, and they have these like beautiful Art Deco depictions of how like communication technologies will bring us together. You know, telephone wires and radio unite to make neighbors of nations. It's like, and you know, it's like a little bit similar kind of like intense, like dramatic chauvinism. I just really love the like Jeff Bezos breaking a bottle of champagne on a wind turbine image. This is a cheap ploy to make you laugh. The company that I think is probably most salient to this conversation is obviously like Facebook. So do you remember, like maybe you may have remembered this like 2017 blog post where Mark Zuckerberg talked about like building global community. It was sort of his like post-election like mea culpa moment. And he used this phrase. Did I make that? Oh, I didn't include, there was a GIF version of this, but I think it's not playing. Anyway, so he used this phrase, social infrastructure, like 15 times in this blog post. And he kind of played fast and loose with what that actually meant. Like the first time he invokes it, he said, social infrastructure, like communities, media, and governments, which like, those are like, that's like a bold, like, I don't know, like social infrastructure is a thing, like libraries perhaps would be a good example. But he then kind of goes on to be like talking about social infrastructure in terms of like first responders, and then he's talking about voting, and like, it becomes kind of apparent that actually he just means more Facebook. Like when you say social infrastructure for building global community, what you mean is Facebook and more Facebook. And like there was a period of time, like when you go look back at like how the company described itself, where they like very briefly actually did invoke utilities, right? Like this was when you went to like the login page. These were like the descriptions of what Facebook was. In 2008, probably realizing that if they kept saying they were a utility, they might get regulated like one. They switched to just saying that like Facebook helps you connect. I think now it's like written as an imperative, like it's connect with Facebook. But that kind of, there's this kind of like inherent understanding like that it does this sort of like central like reordering of public life. The other kind of interesting infrastructural turn that didn't quite go where I think they were hoping it would was in 2014, Mark Zuckerberg announced that the slogan of the company was no longer move fast and break things, but move fast with stable infrastructure. It didn't really take off. I think actually the slogan now might just be move fast. If anyone here, it's, yeah, right. So I think the infrastructure is a funny word, right? And the distinction, I realize this sounds like I'm getting a little bit just like hermeneutic and like the meanings of words here, but the distinction between a utility, or another word that has kind of fallen out of favor, which is public works, and an infrastructure is you kind of understand the like power relationship and the subjects involved in that thing. Like I go back often to like Paul Edwards' essay, Infrastructure and Modernity, to think about like the ways in which what an infrastructural thing is and what it does as kind of environment or ideology means. Like it's a relational thing, right? It's fuzzy, and like, but that's an understanding of what infrastructure is that most of a public isn't probably thinking that much about. Like this is probably a unique audience in that like when I say infrastructure, your eyes don't immediately glaze over. And the subtext of the word in like a shorthand is that you're dealing with something that is integral, without which kind of like something cannot possibly exist, and like kind of indispensable. Which in a way, like the second that you kind of declare that Facebook is a central like infrastructure of communications in society, you're also kind of saying it's too big to fail. And it also creates a condition in which Facebook's kind of continued fuck-ups in its ability to kind of recognize like massive harms that are occurring on its platform become something that can only really be like triaged and managed, and of course only triaged and managed by Facebook, rather than something that maybe makes us question like whether this was a good idea at all. Because like to destroy central infrastructure is an act of terrorism, so like no one's going to be kind of like changing the environments of Facebook. And I think it also kind of creates an interesting like accountability vacuum when you kind of declare like, well, like, but it's infrastructure, like we can't possibly kind of like take responsibility for this. Like everyone's very sorry, but nobody's actually responsible. And one of my favorite things to search on Twitter are people who want to send Mark Zuckerberg to the International Criminal Court. Because first of all, like it's very good fanfic, but that's not really how like the ICC operates. And secondly, there's something like kind of heartbreaking about the fact that like imagination for like thinking that the federal government can do anything is so atrophied. We literally have to go to the ICC to try and like address this environment. And that also kind of brings up a weird question, right? Like, why is it that like, why would a government like let something become this too big to fail? And I think there is kind of a mutually beneficial dynamic between governments and platforms as infrastructure, right? Because it has allowed gaps in public works and utilities to basically be patched with the sort of ad hoc power of the network, right? Like the fact that I have to crowdfund to pay my medical bills is not proof that like people are really altruistic and like the network works. It's evidence that our medical system's broken. And I think the fact that like and I think that there's sort of like, yeah, a beneficial relationship of like governments that perhaps like can't cover all of these gaps, or like will choose not to, or will choose to continue to atrophy public services, can kind of like look to this network that is increasingly kind of given leeway to organize social relations and public life to triage. And I don't know, I saw Virginia Eubanks at a panel earlier this week, and she made a very salient point that like triage is a political choice, and it usually is made assuming that more resources are coming. But if no more resources come, like you're actually just rationing resources. One of the questions when I was emailing with Sarah about this panel, just trying to think of like framings for these things, one of the questions she asked was like if there was an example of sort of like a physical infrastructure hack that paralleled the sort of co-optation of Facebook for misinformation campaigns and like hate speech kind of proliferation. And I think, I don't know if co-optation is the right word, because I think it always was kind of like, this is the system working as designed, whether or not you realize that it could be inhabited with vipers, it was a pit of snakes. You know, this like is a platform designed to maximize like attention, engagement, and user growth. Most of the like so-called hacks and co-optations like are kind of just playing into like things the platform was made to do, right? It just happens that now it's things we feel bad about. Maybe if there is a physical infrastructure comparison of sort of a public-private partnership, I feel like maybe a salient example might be like the construction of public life and transportation in the United States around the automobile, right? Like we did not necessarily have to choose that channel of doing things. And when it was decided that this was sort of the inevitable channel through which things would happen, lots of federal investment and federal decisions about kind of like the way that roads would work happens. And lots of unintended consequences come with that, right? Like destruction of neighborhoods and reinforcement of segregation and increased dependence on fossil fuels. And we absolutely can't lay that all at Henry Ford's feet any more than we can lay the present moment's crises on at like Mark Zuckerberg's. But I do think there is an interesting question of like whether or not, like acknowledgement that like these are choices and infrastructures are not inevitable kind of constructs. Should I have done? So this is I went to an electronics recycling trade show a couple years ago, and this is the slogan of a company that makes a hardware shredder. The future is here and everything needs to be destroyed. Don't fall behind the times. And like at the time I was like, this is the most 2016 thing I've ever seen, because it was 2016. And I feel like this is the question or the challenge I feel like I'm faced with when looking at the present moment is like, I feel like this is actually kind of the operating principle of like the fascists presently in power. There is like a cancellation of the future taking place. And I don't want to kind of just end up like in a nihilistic state about this, but I also wonder like whether or not there is a point at which like considering which things we actually may in fact have to destroy to and which kinds of catastrophes we are willing to accept, because like to like end Facebook tomorrow would almost certainly create entirely new crises, right? Like that's a pretty bad idea. But I question whether or not like more or less people would die, because like people are dying right now. I think there's, maybe that's a weird place to end, but I think that I'm really excited to get to be part of this conversation, and thank you so much for having me.
Wide-ranging panel. But there were a couple themes that I picked up that I thought were really interesting, and I think the fact that it feels so disconnected to talk about districts and the technology of voting and our social infrastructure that's influencing voting, or other infrastructures and how we think about infrastructure, says something about where we are. Like these are clearly in the same conversation, but it's also kind of hard to put them in the same conversation. And I think there's something important about that. One of the things that really struck me were the various roles of tools and equipment in constructing our civic life. That there's a lot of mythology about the civic life as being one-to-one, right? We each have a vote, and we're citizens, and we're here, and we have addresses, and we have equal rights. But the technologies that we're using, and I loved from kind of taking from gerrymandering, the idea of the intention and justification and a way of thinking about technology in general, or the ways that we use technology for intentionally good purposes, intentionally bad actor purposes, unintentional consequences, that was really present in all of your talks.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I like about the the way technology is developing is that in 2010, it was very clear that, I mean, the mapping software costs $10,000. To get the data for a state costs $1,000. So if you want to be able to assess what's happening, you need $60,000, which no, Joe average has. And so back then, it really was the case, and I didn't go through too much about Wisconsin, but there were 9 hard drives, and one of them had a hole drilled through it when they came to try to find out what actually happened. So it was like this, we can hide from you these fancy things we're doing, and they had a political scientist on staff, and they were making these models. But when we looked at them in 2014 and had some of our political scientists look at it, they were like, oh, it's just like a basic regression. It's not. In fact, one of them ended up being just adding some election results together. And I was like, oh, like we've come a little further. And the other thing is there are all of these great online resources now. So the Harvard Dataverse, you can get election results down to the census block level. There are online mapping software tools where you don't need thousands and thousands of dollars to do it. You can go in yourself. And then obviously we have our website where we're trying to say, hey, any plan that you produce, you can just put it on here and we'll score it for you. The hope is that when we get to 2020, if those tools people are aware of them, then even if they want to go behind closed doors and produce a map, they always have to produce one and then a few hours later vote on it. And if we only have a few hours, at least we can get out the fact that this is not fair and all the communities that this is affecting. One of the things I would love, there used to be on DNA Info, a thing in Chicago, because I moved there 6 years ago, I'm very interested in the neighborhoods thing, like where do I live, where could I live? And there was a thing where you could go in and you could pick your community, so you would draw the boundaries of where you think your little neighborhood is, and it would show you yours compared to everybody else, and it was like some people thought that theirs was really small, some people thought theirs was really big, and I was like, it would be so cool if people could do that, and you could kind of get those results and give them to the people drawing the districts. Because if they say we care about community, I'm like, yeah, well, that's dynamite, but like you're from downstate, how do you know where my community is? So I feel like there's these tools that hopefully have been used for evil, but maybe we can use them for good in 2020 when we have, people like everyone here, like putting stuff online to help.
No other thoughts on that subject. Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and I think the technologies. I guess in one way are, they're neutral in their construction, but they're not neutral in their use, right? And so I think moving back and forth and thinking about I loved his name, Yarish, and the construction of the system around him. Another kind of thread for me, and I think especially in thinking about the voting equipment work that you're doing, is when we see it, that infrastructure is, when it's working, invisible, and it's the more it's working, the more invisible it is in a way, or maybe even if it's not working. But the idea of the glitch or the unexpected result and how that shows us something else that's also happening, or what the technology is also doing. And I think with Facebook, that I don't know if we can call oppression through Facebook a glitch. I mean, I think you said, I wrote down under glitch, I said, the system is working as it was designed, as you said in your speech. But I think as we see these unexpected results, we can also see better the technology that's producing them. And that feels really present in all three of your talks.
Yeah, and building on something that Ruth was saying, I do think that we have this issue with technology just changing so rapidly that we're constantly playing catch up with, in terms of figuring out how, who would have thought a few years ago that Facebook could and YouTube could have such a, I would say in many ways, a negative impact on our politics and our discourse. I really do think it caught a lot of people by surprise. And all the things that we're talking about, the promise of technology to deliver good things is legitimate, but where the negative impacts it feels in the past few years like that there is just a lot of catch-up to try to figure out how to contain them.
Well, and so, and some of that has to do with like kind of a long-standing American allergy to regulation, I think, particularly when it comes to the computers. I mean, in that example I was giving about just sort of like if you were to kind of look at the way that like the automobile has been was like normalized as a piece of American transportation as like a similar kind of like weird symbiotic relationship of like development of like public life. If you could imagine like the idea that to address like emission standards in the federal government, like they were like, hey, automobile industry, you should partner with environmental advocacy groups to provide messaging to people to think about how much they're using their cars. Because like that's more or less what like fighting misinformation on Facebook looks like. We're going to like find people to like help us make sure that these things are facts and try and put like things in someone's timeline to maybe make them question this. This is the approach that was like taken with civil society groups in Myanmar for a very long time. And it's like, if we were to do that with cars, like if we were to say like, maybe we should just like tell people to think about seatbelts, like that would be bananas.
Although they do that with like calorie counting, right? So it's like you now on all food regulations have to say what calories or what things are in there. I actually kind of like the idea of, it feels like I'm with you, America hates regulation. There's a great quote from an Israeli economist who's like, live free or die, light regulation and live. But maybe the version of, we're not telling you what to do, but we are providing you with all the information to realize that's a terrible choice. Like maybe that's an on-ramp, you know?
Well, the conflation, I think, of private industry and public infrastructure, public works, is part of that question, right? So you wouldn't ask the auto industry to regulate how all the information that we should have to make the right choices. You would think about that being placed on them, like calorie counts are now placed on food, but it's not the food industry that's driving that. They're responding to it. But we've kind of conflated that, I think, both in the voting machines and with social infrastructure, I suppose we'll just call it now, that we've kind of flipped that, or we don't quite know where the private parts are and where the public parts are.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if you know much about you probably do, the Los Angeles County, aren't they making their own voting machines now?
Yes.
Like they worked out all of the private vendors were not giving them what they needed. And I sort of thought, well, that's kind of cool actually, if they develop something that really works well. But at the same time, if you're the person in charge of the voting machines, like, thank you very much. They can sell them to every county.
Right. Well, I mean, this gets back to my point about Los Angeles County has a lot of resources, and they had a lot of actually leftover money from 2002, so they were able to do this. But that's going to be tough for other jurisdictions to replicate. And it goes back to my point about the fact that we don't invest in elections or civic life generally, I would say, in the United States.
I read this cool book about the first South African election. It's called Birth by Peter Harris. So in 1994, when they were having their election with a country that was largely illiterate, and they had a ballot with 80 people on it, they had to work out in 3 months how to do it. But the relevant part of that was on election night, they worked out that their election machines were being hacked because there were public things coming out. So all they did was they kept counting in the hacked room, and they separately had hand counting in a separate room just with paper ballots. And I was like, that kind of worked because they had paper ballots, and because everything was centralized, right? There was one place where they said, wait a second, we've worked out what's going on. And so at the end of the night, it was kind of like the Yano thing you mentioned. They were like, and actually the winner is Mandela. Right. But here, you couldn't do that. I feel like when I was in Wisconsin 2016, the minute that it was clear which way it was going, people just started these, what seemed at the time conspiracy theories about every machine must have been hacked. Partly because you couldn't believe that people would actually vote the way they voted, but also because nobody trusts the machinery. So you then have this, people just don't even believe in the leaders that we get. It's problematic, no?
Yes, yeah, and I would say, I think that's even that's even becoming more of a problem for a lot of the reasons that Ingrid referred to. I don't know if 20 years ago there would have been such distrust in the system, but you do now have, because of social media, so many conspiracy theories immediately popping up, and people want to believe these things. They're more likely to.
I mean, all successful conspiracy theories have a tiny grain of truth, right? And I think the grain of truth that kind of lies within this is in some ways this also is part of how America has been designed, right? With so much of the foundation of the voting system in America was like also about systematically oppressing people. So it's like, well,
Keeping
yeah.
people from having a voice.
Yeah. I mean, there was a, shout out to the 3/5 compromise at the beginning of this panel. It's like, it is not surprising to imagine that something has been like kind of created to like systematically harm or like deny people a voice in this country, because it happens all the time. It's the problem with good conspiracies.
I think we have a couple minutes for crowd questions. Anybody have any for individual panelists or the group?
We have a microphone here which helps us with our recording and webcast. It's squishy. It looks like you might be able to throw it. Please don't throw it today.
What a delight.
But you're welcome to pass it lightly down the rows, and our usher will bring it to you if you raise your hand.
Wow.
And you have to like really talk.